They had been waiting for weeks, restless young recruits who thought the world owed them glory, laughter, and the easy victories they had seen in movies. The camp was alive with noise, boots striking gravel, orders shouted down the parade ground, the harsh sound of metal clanging against rifles as drills went on from morning to night. Among these men, all filled with pride and the confidence of their youth, walked a figure that did not match their expectations. Her name was Captain Elena Ward, and her arrival stirred more whispering than respect. She was not much older than them, barely in her early 30s, but she carried the authority of years in the field. Yet it wasn't her age or even her gender that first caught their mocking eyes, it was her boots. They were worn, the leather scuffed and dull, not polished to a mirror shine like the rest of the unit's standard-issue footwear. To the recruits, who had been drilled mercilessly on appearances, uniforms, and spotless presentation, her boots looked like an insult to military discipline. They snickered behind her back, some bold enough to laugh openly when she passed, muttering about how the commander must have scraped the bottom of the barrel to send them someone who could not even shine her gear. Elena heard it all, but her face betrayed nothing. She simply walked on, those old boots carrying her with the calm certainty of someone who had no time to waste on proving herself to boys who thought war was a game. In the evenings, when the day's drills ended, the recruits gathered in the mess hall, boasting about their imagined future heroics. They spoke of medals and victories, of charging fearlessly into battle. When Elena entered, quiet and reserved, carrying her tray, the whispers began again. One recruit, a tall, broad-shouldered farm boy named Harris, leaned over to his friends and said loudly enough for her to hear, "If the enemy sees those boots, they'll probably die laughing before we even fire a shot." Laughter erupted at the table, echoing through the hall. Elena placed her tray down, ate in silence, and left without a word. To the recruits, her silence was proof she was weak, maybe even ashamed. But what they did not understand was that she had seen more than their shallow eyes could imagine. Every scuff on those boots was a memory etched in mud, blood, and fire. They had marched through deserts where the air shimmered with heat, through jungles where death lurked in every shadow, through ruins where the screams of civilians never faded. She wore them not out of neglect, but because they reminded her of the lives she had saved and the lives she had lost. Training intensified as the days passed. The recruits groaned under the weight of their packs, their bodies aching from endless marches and obstacle courses. They mocked her still, though quieter now, for she demanded more from them than any instructor before. When they stumbled, she pushed them up. When they faltered, she demanded another mile, another repetition, another drop of sweat. Yet even as she drove them hard, she never raised her voice in cruelty, never humiliated them. She simply expected more, as if she could already see the battle waiting ahead. Still, the recruits mistook her calm for weakness. "She doesn't even shout properly," another recruit sneered one night. "How's she going to lead anyone when bullets start flying?" Harris and the others agreed, their laughter masking the gnawing unease that had begun to creep into their minds. Because despite their mocking, they were improving. They were faster, stronger, more alert, and deep down, some part of them suspected it was because of her. One gray morning, long before dawn had lifted, the alarm sounded across the camp. It was no drill. Word spread fast. A neighboring outpost had gone silent, its last transmission a garbled warning of movement in the hills. The recruits, barely out of training, were ordered to prepare for a live mission. Panic rippled through the group, though few dared to show it. They were soldiers now, at least on paper, but none had faced real combat. They looked to the seasoned officers for reassurance, and instead they were told that Captain Elena Ward would be leading them. The laughter that had once come so easily to their lips died in silence. The reality of battle loomed, and suddenly her scuffed boots seemed less a joke and more a mystery. The march to the outpost was long, the silence broken only by the crunch of gear and the rustle of wind through dry grass. Elena walked at the front, her stride steady, her boots carrying her with unshakable certainty. The recruits followed, nerves tightening like coiled wire in their chests. Every shadow in the hills looked like an ambush, every gust of wind sounded like whispers of danger. Elena gave crisp, clear orders, her voice calm, never raised, never uncertain. She moved like someone who had walked this path 100 times before, scanning the terrain with eyes that missed nothing. Slowly the recruits began to feel something they had not expected: trust. When they reached the outpost, the silence was heavy, unnatural. Barricades were broken, sandbags torn apart, and the faint smell of smoke hung in the air. No bodies, no voices, just the eerie stillness of a place abandoned in haste. The recruits' hands trembled on their rifles, fear crawling into their throats. Harris, who had once laughed the loudest, now found himself staring at Elena, waiting for her command. She crouched, touching the dirt, studying the ground with a focus they could not comprehend. Then she spoke quietly but firmly, "They're watching us. Get low. Follow me exactly." Without hesitation she moved, and though fear gripped their hearts, the recruits obeyed. Minutes later the ambush sprang. Figures burst from the rocks, weapons flashing in the dim light, and the world erupted into chaos. The recruits froze for a heartbeat, but Elena did not. She barked commands with sharp precision, her movements swift and decisive. She guided them into cover, directed their fire, and turned what could have been a slaughter into a defense. Her old boots carried her through the smoke and dust, never faltering, never hesitating. The recruits, terrified yet galvanized by her certainty, followed her every word. And in that moment, the laughter that had once echoed at her expense was gone, replaced by the desperate realization that their survival depended entirely on her. The hills exploded with gunfire, echoing through the narrow passes as if the very mountains had turned against them. The recruits clutched their rifles, hands shaking, vision blurred by panic. For most of them, this was the first time they had faced an enemy who was not a target on a training range, and the difference was terrifying. Bullets tore into the ground around them, sparks flying from rocks, the air thick with dust and the bitter sting of gunpowder. Harris tried to remember the drills, the commands shouted at him during training, but his mind was blank with fear. He glanced at Elena, and in that single look, everything shifted. She was calm, focused, not a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She moved low and fast, signaling with her hand, her voice cutting through the chaos like steel. "Left flank, suppressive fire. You cover that ridge. Don't think, move." The words jolted Harris back into himself, and before he could question, he obeyed. The recruits stumbled into action, each clinging desperately to her instructions. Elena directed them with the precision of someone who had lived this 100 times before, positioning them where the terrain gave them cover, where their angles overlapped, where panic could not break the line. Her boots struck the ground with purpose, carrying her across open patches that would have frozen any of them in terror. She was everywhere, at one moment pulling a trembling recruit to safety, at another returning fire with a deadly calm. Her movements seemed choreographed by survival itself. And slowly something remarkable happened. The recruits stopped thinking of themselves as frightened boys with rifles and began to move as soldiers, each tied to the next by the steady thread of her leadership. The ambush pressed hard. The enemy had the numbers, the higher ground, and the advantage of surprise. But they did not have Elena Ward. She anticipated their maneuvers, countered their angles, ordered smoke grenades to cut lines of sight, and shifted her team like pieces on a board. When a machine gun opened fire from above, pinning them down, Elena crawled forward under a hail of bullets, directing 2 recruits to lay suppressing fire while she moved into position. Harris, watching her, felt something strange burn in his chest. Not fear, not shame, but respect so fierce it bordered on awe. This was no fragile officer hiding behind rank. This was a leader who risked her life with every step, who bore the weight of their survival without a tremor. As the firefight dragged on, the recruits began to change. Panic gave way to focus, fear to determination. They shouted to each other, moved with purpose, their training finally coming alive in the crucible of battle. Harris fired until his rifle smoked, reloaded with trembling but steadying hands, and found himself shouting encouragement to the boy beside him. For the first time they were not individuals struggling to prove themselves, they were a unit, and at the center of that transformation stood Elena. Her old boots, once a symbol of mockery, pounded against the dirt as she dashed between positions, never faltering, never breaking. The fight lasted an eternity, or perhaps only minutes. Time dissolved into the rhythm of survival. Fire, move, reload, listen for her voice, fire again. At last, the enemy began to fall back, their ambush broken by the unexpected ferocity of recruits who should have been easy prey. The final shots echoed into silence, leaving only the ringing in their ears and the shallow, desperate gasps of breath. Dust settled slowly like the end of a storm. The recruits remained in cover, stunned by what had just happened, rifles still clutched tightly in their hands. Then Elena rose, scanning the hills, her weapon steady, her breathing controlled. Only when she was certain it was over did she signal for them to regroup. They gathered in a tight circle, eyes wide, faces streaked with sweat and dirt. Some trembled, some wept quietly, unable to stop the flood of emotions crashing through them. Harris stared at her boots, caked now with dust and mud, and felt shame burn through him for every cruel word he had ever spoken. Those boots had carried her through fire and blood before, and now they had carried her through this, through saving every single one of them. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words would not come. She looked at them each in turn, her gaze steady, and said simply, "You did well. You held the line. Remember this, fear is not your enemy. It is the voice that tells you what matters most." They listened in silence, the weight of her words settling heavier than any lecture they had ever heard. In that moment they understood what discipline truly meant, not polished boots or perfect uniforms, but the will to stand, to fight, to protect each other when everything seemed lost. The recruits had mocked her once, laughed at the scuffs on her leather, but now they saw the truth. Those boots had walked further than any of them could imagine, and under her command they had taken their first steps into becoming real soldiers. The march back to camp was different. There was no laughter, no whispers behind her back. The recruits walked in silence, processing what they had survived. Harris found himself staring at the horizon, his mind replaying every order she had given, every action she had taken. He realized he owed his life to the woman he had mocked, that his survival was stamped into the dirt by the soles of her boots. And though his pride stung, respect filled the space where mockery had once lived. They all felt it. The recruits who had once snickered behind her back now followed her with eyes that held only admiration. They knew without her they would be nothing more than names etched into stone. That night the camp was quiet. The recruits sat together, but the usual boasts and laughter were gone. Instead they shared quiet stories of fear and relief, of the moments they thought they would die. Elena sat alone at a table in the corner, her expression unreadable as always. Harris stood, heart pounding, and walked toward her. Every step felt like dragging a weight, but he forced himself to move. When he reached her, he cleared his throat. "Captain," he said, his voice rough, "about your boots? I was wrong." She looked up at him, the faintest flicker of a smile in her eyes, and replied, "You're alive. That's what matters." Then she returned to her meal, and Harris realized that for her, the laughter had never mattered. Only the mission, only their lives. And that truth, simple and sharp, would stay with him forever. The mission had ended, but its shadow lingered. Days passed at the training camp, yet the recruits no longer felt the same as before. They trained harder, pushed themselves further, but now it was not pride or ego that drove them, it was the memory of how close death had come, and how Captain Elena Ward had stood in its path. Their laughter was gone, replaced by a sober respect that deepened each time they saw her stride across the grounds, those scuffed boots thudding against the dirt with the steady rhythm of certainty. The once mocking whispers had turned into quiet conversations filled with curiosity and admiration. They wondered about her past, about the scars invisible beneath her calm exterior. Some speculated she must have seen entire wars unfold, others believed she had led elite units in missions no one would ever hear about. But the truth was something Elena carried alone, locked away behind eyes that revealed nothing. Harris, who had been the loudest of her critics, now found himself drawn to her presence with an almost desperate need to understand. He watched the way she trained them, demanding but never cruel, relentless but always fair. She corrected their mistakes without belittling them, and when they succeeded she gave only a nod as if acknowledgement was enough to fuel them. It wasn't the praise they craved anymore, but the weight of her recognition. Harris realized he had never respected anyone this way before, and it unsettled him. At night, when the recruits whispered stories in the barracks, he often stayed silent, lost in the memory of her voice cutting through the chaos of the ambush. The unit's transformation was not lost on the senior officers. Reports from the field mission had spread quickly, and the story of a captain leading untested recruits through an ambush had caught the attention of those higher in command. Some praised her leadership, others whispered their doubts, unable to reconcile the image of a woman with worn boots leading where men twice her size had faltered. Yet, regardless of politics and opinion, the truth was undeniable. The recruits were sharper, more disciplined, and more unified under her than they had been under anyone else. Even the drill sergeants, once dismissive, began to notice the change. But Elena herself remained unchanged. She gave no speeches, sought no credit, and carried herself with the same quiet certainty as before. Another mission came sooner than expected. Intelligence reported hostile forces moving supplies through a valley not far from the camp. The recruits, still technically in training, were ordered to accompany Elena as a reconnaissance unit. It was meant to be simple: observe, report, avoid engagement. But the recruits knew by now that simple plans rarely stayed simple. As they prepared their gear, Harris noticed something. While everyone else polished their boots until they gleamed, Elena tightened the same old pair she had worn through the ambush. The leather was more battered now, the seams strained, but still, she wore them as if they were part of her very identity. For the first time no one laughed. Instead, a kind of reverence filled the room. Those boots had walked them through fire once. They trusted they would do so again. The march into the valley was long and tense. The recruits kept their voices low, their eyes scanning the horizon as Elena had taught them. They moved with discipline now, each step careful, each formation precise. Elena led from the front, her gaze always on the terrain, searching for signs others might miss. The valley stretched wide, hemmed by jagged cliffs, the kind of place perfect for an ambush. Harris felt his stomach tighten with unease, but he trusted her judgment. When she raised her hand to halt the column, every recruit froze instantly, no hesitation. They had learned to move as extensions of her command, and in that moment, it was clear, they were no longer boys playing soldier. Elena crouched low, studying the ground. Tracks fresh, heavy, moving in numbers. She motioned them forward slowly, silently, guiding them through cover until they reached an outcrop overlooking the valley floor. Below they saw it, a convoy of enemy vehicles guarded, heavily armed. More than they had expected, far more. The recruits' hearts pounded in their chests, adrenaline surging. This was no simple reconnaissance. If they were discovered, survival would depend once again on her leadership. Harris whispered to the man beside him, "We should pull back, report it in." But Elena raised a hand, signaling silence. Her eyes scanned the convoy, calculating. She knew something the recruits did not. The enemy had paused, setting up camp. That meant they would stay in the valley through the night. Elena's mind worked quickly, piecing together the possibilities. A chance like this, to cripple supply lines, to weaken enemy movement, was rare. But to strike with recruits who had barely survived their first fight? The risk was immense. She waited in seconds, then turned to them. "We're not here to fight," she whispered, her voice steady. "But we will prepare in case the fight comes to us. Dig in. Cover positions. Quiet. Move." Her calm authority cut through their fear, replacing it with focus. Without hesitation, the recruits obeyed. Through the night, they watched the enemy below, nerves stretched to breaking. Every crack of a branch, every shift of wind made their hearts race. But under Elena's steady guidance, they held their positions. She moved among them, checking their lines, whispering reassurances, her presence anchoring them like a pillar in the storm. Harris realized that fear had not vanished, it never would, but with her near, it became bearable, something they could endure. Hours dragged on, the moon casting silver light across the valley. And then, just before dawn, the unexpected happened. A patrol of enemy soldiers broke off from the convoy, heading directly toward the outcrop where they were hidden. The recruits froze, panic threatening to undo all their preparation. But Elena did not flinch. She gave a single hand signal, and instantly the unit tightened into silence. They watched as the patrol drew closer, each step bringing discovery nearer. Harris felt sweat drip down his temple, his finger trembling against the trigger. The moment stretched, unbearable, until the first enemy soldier looked up, suspicion in his eyes. It was then that Elena whispered, so quietly yet so firmly they all heard, "Wait." And in that single word she held them together. The recruits realized then what true discipline was, not firing too early, not giving in to panic, but trusting her completely, even as danger loomed steps away. The enemy patrol climbed steadily toward the outcrop, boots crunching against loose stone, rifles slung casually as if they expected nothing. The recruits lay flat against the dirt, breath held, hearts pounding so loudly they were certain the enemy could hear. Harris's muscles screamed from the tension, his finger twitching on the trigger, but still he obeyed Elena's command. Her whispered "wait" echoed in his mind like an anchor, holding him steady against the rising tide of panic. He dared a glance at her, and what he saw stilled him further. Her expression was calm, her eyes sharp and unblinking, her hands steady as stone. Those battered boots were planted firmly in the dirt, as if the ground itself trusted her to stand upon it. The patrol came closer, 10 meters then 5. The recruits could see the whites of their eyes, hear the soft scrape of metal as one adjusted his weapon. One wrong move, one cough, one slip of a finger, and the valley would erupt in chaos. Harris felt the weight of inevitability crushing down on him. But Elena remained perfectly still, her hand raised, her posture signaling control. She was waiting for the exact moment, the perfect second where advantage tipped. Then, as the lead soldier glanced down into the brush and his expression began to shift into suspicion, Elena dropped her hand and whispered with sharp finality, "Now." The silence shattered. A controlled burst of gunfire erupted from the recruits' rifles, precise and devastating. The patrol dropped before they had a chance to shout, bodies crumpling silently into the dust. Harris's ears rang, but his hands were steady now, his training no longer lost to fear. The recruits looked to Elena again, expecting orders to retreat, to escape before the entire convoy below noticed. But she did not move to withdraw. Instead she studied the valley, her jaw tightening. She had seen the supply trucks, the munitions crates, the communications equipment, all vital assets. If left untouched, this convoy would fuel weeks of enemy strength. To leave it would mean facing them again, stronger, better supplied. And Elena knew opportunities like this did not return. She called the recruits closer, her voice low, controlled, but carrying a weight that silenced even their pounding hearts. Listen carefully. We were sent to observe. But fate has given us more. That convoy is a threat to every soldier in this region. We can cripple it here tonight. But it will require discipline, silence, and trust. Do exactly as I say and we can do this. Disobey and none of us leave alive. Her eyes met each of theirs in turn, and to their own surprise, not one recruit argued. Not Harris, not the youngest boy barely 18, not the stubborn ones who once mocked her in the mess hall. They all nodded, their fear tempered by something stronger, faith in her. The plan was simple but daring. They would plant charges along the trucks and fuel tanks, crippling the convoy in one strike. But to reach the vehicles, they had to descend the slope, slip through the outer guards, and work in silence beneath the noses of men far more experienced than they were. Elena divided them into pairs, assigning each a target, her instructions precise, her tone steady. She herself took the most dangerous task, infiltrating the command vehicle to seize intelligence before the blast. Harris found himself paired with a recruit named Cole, his hands trembling as he accepted the small pack of explosives. Elena placed a hand briefly on Harris's shoulder, her gaze steady. "You've got this," she said simply. It was not a grand speech, not the fiery call he had once expected leaders to give. But those 3 words filled him with a strength he had never known. The descent into the valley was a test of nerves sharper than any firefight. The recruits moved like shadows, each step measured, every breath controlled. Elena led the way, her battered boots finding paths between rocks with uncanny silence. Harris followed close, sweat cold against his neck, every sound magnified in his ears. A guard coughed nearby, another shifted his rifle, and for a terrifying moment Harris thought it was over. But Elena's hand flicked in a signal, and they froze, pressed into the dirt until the danger passed. Her calm presence kept them from unraveling. One by one they reached their targets. Harris and Cole crawled beneath a truck, the metal chassis looming above them like a coffin. His hands shook as he set the charges, but Elena's training echoed in his mind, steady, precise, deliberate. He forced himself to breathe, to focus, until the explosives were secure. All around the convoy, other pairs did the same, their fear sharpened into focus by her example. Finally, Elena herself slipped into the command vehicle, dispatching the lone guard with quiet efficiency. She rifled through maps, coded messages and radio equipment, seizing everything that could give their side an advantage. Her boots made no sound on the metal floor, her movements as controlled as a surgeon's. The signal came at last, a faint whistle barely audible but clear to trained ears. The recruits withdrew inch by inch, their retreat as silent as their infiltration. They regrouped at the ridge, every heart pounding, every pair of eyes locked on Elena. She held the detonator in her hand, her face as calm as when she had first walked into the mess hall weeks ago. Without ceremony, without flourish, she pressed the trigger. The valley erupted. Fire tore through the convoy, explosions rolling like thunder, the night sky lit with blazing orange and black smoke. Trucks shattered, munitions ignited, fuel tanks burst into roaring infernos. The enemy camp dissolved into chaos, shouts of panic swallowed by the roar of destruction. From their vantage, the recruits watched wide-eyed as the enemy's strength was reduced to ashes in moments. Harris felt a wild surge of triumph, mingled with disbelief. They had done it. Against all odds, they had struck a blow far greater than any training exercise could have prepared them for. And at the center of it all was Elena, her old boots planted firmly in the dirt, her eyes fixed on the flames with the calm of someone who had seen victory and loss enough to know that this was only one battle among many. As the fire consumed the valley, Elena turned to them. "We move. Now." There was no celebration, no pause. She knew the enemy reinforcements would come, and survival still hung by a thread. The recruits obeyed instantly, moving with urgency but without panic, their formation tight, their movements disciplined. They were not the same group who had once laughed at her boots. They were soldiers now, tempered in fire, forged by her leadership. And as they disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a valley of flames, Harris realized that the true measure of a leader was not in the shine of their gear or the sound of their voice, but in the lives they carried with them through the storm. The march back through the darkness was brutal. The valley still burned behind them, orange flames licking the sky, a signal that would draw every enemy unit for miles. Elena pushed them hard, guiding them through rocky gullies and dense brush, always keeping them just ahead of pursuit. The recruits staggered under exhaustion, their bodies bruised, lungs raw from smoke and running. But none dared complain, none dared slow. They followed her as if she were the only thing tethering them to life. Her boots struck the ground with unyielding rhythm, scuffed, battered, but steady, carrying not just her weight but the invisible weight of all their lives. Harris's legs screamed with pain, every muscle begging to collapse, but when his strength faltered, he thought of the ambush, of the way she had looked straight into chaos without blinking, and he forced himself onward. Cole stumbled beside him, nearly falling, but Elena's voice cut through the night. Up. Keep moving. Not shouted, not cruel, just firm, unshakable, undeniable. Cole found his feet again. They all did. One by one, whenever fatigue threatened to break them, her voice pulled them back. It was as if she carried them all forward with sheer will. By dawn, they reached a ridge overlooking their own lines. Relief rippled through the recruits at the sight of friendly flags in the distance. But Elena did not allow them to rest yet. She had them hold position, scanning the horizon, ensuring they were not followed. Only when she was certain of safety did she finally allow the group to descend. They stumbled into camp like ghosts, their uniforms torn, faces smeared with grime, but their eyes alive with the fierce fire of survival. The sentries who saw them return could not believe what they carried. Captured maps, enemy codes, and the story of a convoy reduced to ashes. News spread like wildfire. Officers gathered to hear the account, astonished that raw recruits had accomplished what seasoned units often failed to do. Commendations were promised, reports drafted, and already whispers grew of medals and honors. Yet Elena dismissed it all. She handed over the intelligence without ceremony, gave her debrief with the calm detachment of someone for whom victory was nothing new, and left the officers stunned by her refusal to bask in praise. She returned to her recruits, not as a commander claiming glory, but as a leader checking wounds, ensuring none of them had suffered beyond what could heal. Her priorities never wavered, their lives first, everything else second. That night, the recruits sat together in the barracks, restless from adrenaline and exhaustion. For once, they didn't boast or spin exaggerated tales. They spoke quietly, almost reverently, about what had happened. Harris found himself replaying every moment in his head, the whispered wait, the fire that lit the valley, the way her hand had steadied his shoulder. He had mocked her once, laughed at her boots like a fool. Now he felt something closer to shame. He realized how blind he had been, how much he had mistaken appearance for ability. Around him, others shared the same reflection. The mess hall, once filled with laughter at her expense, now rang with stories of her courage, each one told with the gravity of truth. But not all in the camp welcomed her triumph. Some senior officers viewed her success with suspicion, their pride stung by the thought that a group of green recruits, led by a captain they had underestimated, had achieved what more seasoned men had not. Whispers began to circle, quiet doubts questioning whether her actions had been reckless, whether she had exceeded her orders. To them, rules mattered more than results, and Elena's disregard for rigid command structures made them uneasy. Yet none of this touched her. She had no interest in politics, no care for approval or disapproval. Her measure of success was simple: every one of her recruits had returned alive. That was the only victory she sought. In the days that followed, training resumed, but the atmosphere was transformed. The recruits no longer trained to impress their superiors or to outshine one another. They trained to be worthy of her trust. Every push-up, every drill, every march became a silent promise, to never fail her, to never let her down. Harris, once the loudest voice of mockery, became the hardest worker, pushing himself until his body nearly broke. When others stumbled, he helped them up, repeating her words, "Fear is not your enemy. It's the voice that tells you what matters most." Slowly, the recruits became a unit in truth, bound not by orders on paper but by loyalty forged in fire. Elena watched their growth with quiet satisfaction but offered no praise beyond a curt nod. She knew too well that battles were still ahead, harder than anything they had yet faced. She drilled them ruthlessly, honing their instincts, sharpening their reflexes, teaching them not just how to fight but how to survive. And though her methods were relentless, they no longer doubted her. They trusted her implicitly, knowing every bruise and blister was preparing them for the next time fate tested their resolve. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Harris found himself lingering after drills, watching Elena clean her rifle in silence. He hesitated, then stepped forward. "Captain," he said softly, his voice unsure. She looked up, her expression unreadable. Harris swallowed, then continued, "Back then, when we laughed at your boots. I was wrong. We all were. He faltered, unable to find the words. Elena studied him for a long moment, then set her rifle aside. "Those boots have walked through battles you'll never read about," she said quietly. "They're scarred, but they've never failed me. Just like scars on people. What matters is not how they look, but that they carry you forward." Harris nodded, the weight of her words sinking deep. He realized then that respect was not something you claimed. It was something you earned, step by step, scar by scar. That night, he sat with the others, telling them what she had said. And in the silence that followed, they understood something profound. Their laughter had been ignorance. Their mockery had been blindness. And their survival, every breath they took now, was owed to the strength of the woman they had once dismissed. From that day forward, not one recruit ever spoke lightly of her boots again. Instead, they became a symbol among them, a reminder that true leadership was not polished or perfect, but worn, tested, and unbreakable. Weeks passed, and the recruits under Captain Elena Ward changed in ways no one outside their circle could fully understand. They were leaner now, harder, sharper. Their eyes no longer held the reckless gleam of boys chasing glory, but the steady weight of soldiers who knew the cost of survival. Rumors of their exploits spread quietly through the camp, exaggerated by retelling, but none of the recruits corrected them. The truth was theirs alone, bound to the memory of fire in the valley and the woman who had led them through it. Elena never spoke of it again. For her, one battle was only a step toward the next, and she refused to let them cling to pride that would dull their edge. But command had taken notice. Word came down that their unit would be tested again, this time with a mission that carried not only risk but consequence. An Allied unit had gone missing beyond the border hills, believed captured or surrounded by hostile forces. Time was running out. Intelligence suggested the enemy planned to move prisoners deeper into their territory. The recruits were to deploy with Elena at first light, tasked with reconnaissance and, if possible, extraction. For most, it would be the first mission where failure meant not only their deaths, but the loss of comrades already in chains. The weight of responsibility pressed heavy on their shoulders. Yet none questioned it. Not anymore. The night before departure, the recruits sat together in silence, each lost in thought. Harris stared at his rifle, the metal cool under his fingers, and remembered how easily he had once joked, how easily he had once dismissed danger. Now there was no room for laughter. He looked at Cole, at the youngest recruit, at the scarred faces of his brothers in arms, and he felt a bond stronger than blood. They were no longer just a group thrown together by orders. They were a family forged in fear, trust, and fire. And at the heart of that family was Elena, polishing her rifle quietly in the corner, her boots resting steady against the floor, worn leather catching the dim light. Dawn came cold and gray. They moved out in silence, formation tight, every step disciplined. The hills ahead loomed with a grim kind of beauty, sharp ridges cutting against the sky, shadows hiding threats in every fold of the terrain. Elena walked at the front, her eyes scanning constantly, her senses tuned to the land as if she could read its secrets. The recruits followed without hesitation, every movement shaped by her leadership. Fear lingered, but it no longer ruled them. Under her, fear had become fuel. Hours into the march, they found the first sign. A torn piece of cloth caught on a branch, stained with blood, marked the trail of the missing unit. Elena crouched, studying the ground, her fingers brushing faint footprints in the dirt. She motioned them onward, their pace quickening, tension thickening. The trail led them through narrow ravines and across dry riverbeds until at last they reached a ridge overlooking a small valley. There, surrounded by enemy patrols and makeshift barricades, lay the Allied prisoners, bound, exhausted, but alive. The recruits' hearts clenched at the sight. The prisoners were guarded heavily, the camp positioned to repel any attack. A direct assault would be suicide. Harris felt his breath catch. "We can't," he whispered. But Elena turned, her eyes burning with resolve. "We can. And we will." Her plan was audacious, risky to the edge of madness, but it was the only chance. They would wait until nightfall, using the cover of darkness to slip past patrols, neutralize guards, and free the prisoners before the enemy realized the camp had been breached. Every step would demand precision, silence, and courage. Failure meant not just death but capture, and for soldiers, capture was worse than death. The recruits listened, their nerves stretched thin, but none spoke against her. They had learned the hard way that if Elena said it could be done, then it could. As night fell, the valley transformed into a shadowed maze. The enemy lit fires around their camp, silhouettes moving lazily in the flickering glow, confident in their superiority. Elena's unit moved like phantoms, slipping between rocks, crawling through brush,